She had built a billion-dollar company from a wheelchair. She had fired executives who ran Fortune 500 divisions. She had walked away from mergers that would have made her the most powerful woman in the industry. But on a gray Tuesday morning, Evelyn Sterling did something nobody in her 30 floors of headquarters had ever witnessed. She chased a man who had already failed his interview, a man with holes in his jacket, a broken backpack strap, and a 7-year-old daughter waiting at home. And the moment she stopped him, every carefully constructed rule about success started to crack. If this story already has your attention, you're exactly who it was made for. Hit that subscribe button and stay with us, because we release new stories every week that will surprise you, move you, and remind you what people are truly capable of. Drop a like and tell us in the comments what city and country you're watching from. You have no idea how far this story has already traveled. The elevator doors were already halfway shut. Evelyn Sterling saw it from the second-floor balcony. The gap narrowing, the silver panels sliding together with that soft hydraulic sigh that meant the lobby was about to swallow the moment whole. She gripped the railing of her wheelchair with both hands and leaned forward slightly, the way she always did when something was slipping away from her and she wasn't ready to let it go. "Diane," she said. Her assistant materialized at her shoulder the way assistants trained by Evelyn Sterling always did, silently and immediately. "That man," Evelyn said. "The one with the backpack. Stop him." Diane blinked. "Ma'am?" "He's leaving the building. Don't let him get into a cab." Diane was 26, efficient, and had worked for Evelyn long enough to know that questions were expensive. She was already moving toward the stairs before Evelyn finished the sentence, her heels clicking across the polished concrete with the urgent rhythm of someone who understood that her boss did not repeat herself. Below, in the lobby of Hale Dynamics corporate headquarters, a cluster of executives stood frozen near the reception desk. They had heard the exchange. They were watching Diane descend the staircase at something just below a full run, and their expressions carried the particular brand of bewilderment reserved for moments when power behaves in ways power isn't supposed to. Evelyn ignored. She turned her wheelchair to face the glass-paneled wall that overlooked the street, and she waited. His name was Mason Carter, and he was already calculating the walk to the nearest subway entrance when he heard someone calling behind him. "Sir? Sir, excuse me?" He stopped because he was raised to stop. Not because he had any particular reason to believe someone was calling for him. He'd left that building 3 minutes ago with a polite handshake and a "we'll be in touch" that he recognized immediately as a professionally delivered rejection. He'd been interviewed enough times over the past 2 years to know exactly what it meant when the HR director smiled too widely while saying goodbye. He turned around. A young woman in a charcoal blazer was half jogging across the sidewalk toward him, slightly out of breath, holding a visitor lanyard in one hand as though she wasn't sure what to do with it. "Mr. Carter?" "Yeah." He shifted the backpack on his shoulder. The left strap had frayed through at the buckle 3 weeks ago, and he'd rewoven it with a strip of nylon webbing from a hardware store remnant bin. It held, but it always slipped after about 20 minutes. He'd been meaning to fix it properly. He hadn't had time. "Ms. Sterling would like to speak with you," the woman said. She paused, collecting her breath. "If you're available." Mason looked at her. "Ms. Sterling," he repeated. "The CEO." "Yes." He glanced down the block. The subway entrance was 40 yards away. He had exactly enough money on his transit card to get across town and back, with nothing left over. Sophie's school pickup was at 3:15, and it was currently 11:40. He had time. Barely. "Okay," he said. The lobby of Hale Dynamics smelled like climate-controlled air and fresh-cut concrete, that particular combination that said the building was expensive, but trying to look like it wasn't trying. Floor-to-ceiling windows on the eastern wall caught the morning light and threw long, pale rectangles across the stone floor. The reception desk was an arc of pale birch and brushed aluminum. The potted plants near the elevator bank were real, which Mason noticed because fake plants always looked a little too symmetrical. He'd noticed the lobby on his way in earlier too, but differently. On the way in, he'd been tracking the angles of the ceiling, noting where the maintenance access panels were, whether the HVAC returns looked recently cleaned, whether the light fixtures were LED retrofits or original installed units. 32 years of working with his hands had given him a particular kind of vision that most people in suits didn't possess. He looked at a building the way a doctor looks at a patient. He saw what was working. He saw what was about to break. The cleaning cart was still in roughly the same position he'd left it. The elderly janitor, his name tag had read Gus in faded blue ink, was kneeling beside the wheel housing, pressing a cloth to the base as though compression alone might fix a snapped retention pin. It wouldn't. Mason had spotted that 3 seconds after walking past it the first time. He'd stopped, not because he planned to, but because watching someone fight a problem with the wrong solution was something he physically couldn't walk past. "I got it," he'd told Gus, setting his backpack down. Gus had looked up at him with the cautious expression of a man who'd been offered help enough times by people who actually wanted to feel good about themselves. "I can manage." "The pin's gone," Mason said. "Right side of the axle housing. You see that? Little sleeve inside the wheel hub. It's sheared. You could compress that all day and it'd just keep wobbling." He'd already pulled a small flathead screwdriver from the front pocket of his bag. He carried it the way other people carry a pen. "You got a zip tie or a rubber gasket ring anywhere on this cart? Even a heavy rubber band would hold it long enough for maintenance to send you a replacement part." Gus had stared at him for a long moment. Then he'd gone into the cart's lower shelf and pulled out a bundle of heavy-duty cable ties. It had taken Mason 4 minutes. While he worked on the wheel, several of the documents scattered across the lobby floor from the earlier impact were still lying there. Mason gathered them without comment, organized them loosely by size, and set them in a neat pile on the cart's upper shelf. "Thank you," Gus said when it was done. "Good wheel now," Mason said, giving it a spin. "Should last you a week or two. After that, get them to order a proper pin. Part number will be stamped on the inside of the hub." He'd shouldered his backpack and walked toward the elevator for his interview. He hadn't thought about it again until just now. Diane brought him to the second floor. Evelyn Sterling was waiting at the far end of a conference room that looked out over the street. She was seated at the head of the table, though seated was a word that barely captured it. There was a stillness about her that Mason associated with people who had learned to take up space deliberately, because they'd spent time in rooms where the instinct was to make themselves smaller. She was around 30, maybe slightly older, with dark hair pulled back and the kind of focused expression that made you feel like you were being read before you'd said anything. The wheelchair was matte black, custom-framed, with low-profile tires and a control panel on the right armrest that she wasn't using. She moved it herself, by hand, with the efficiency of someone who had been doing it long enough that it wasn't something she thought about anymore. She looked at him for a moment. "Mr. Carter, thank you for coming back." "Sure," he said. He didn't sit down yet. He wasn't sure if he was supposed to. "Please," she gestured to the chair across from her. "I didn't bring you back for another interview. I want you to know that." He sat, put the backpack between his feet on the floor. "I watched you with Gus," she said. Mason waited. "From up here." She nodded toward the balcony. "I saw the whole thing. You didn't have to stop. Most people don't stop. And you hadn't even been rejected yet, technically. You were about to go into an interview." "The wheel was broken," Mason said. She looked at him steadily. "Yes, it was." He wasn't sure what else she wanted him to say. He hadn't helped Gus because of any particular philosophy. He'd helped him because the wheel was broken and he knew how to fix it, and Gus was struggling. That was the entire equation. "Your interview this morning," Evelyn said. "I read the summary afterward. They said you lacked corporate leadership experience." "That's accurate," Mason said. "They also said you were courteous and professional." "I tried to be." "They rejected you for the maintenance supervisor position." She folded her hands on the table. "What did you think of the position? Honestly." He looked at her. "You want my actual opinion?" "I wouldn't have asked otherwise." He thought about it for a second. Not because he didn't have an answer, but because he was deciding how much of it to give. "The job description was about documentation," he said. "Compliance reports, vendor negotiations, digital maintenance logs. All of that matters. But I didn't see anything in there about the people doing the actual work. Who's mentoring the younger guys? What happens when a senior mechanic burns out? How you keep someone from quitting 3 weeks after you've spent 2 months training them." He paused. "That's the part that breaks most maintenance departments. Not the machines, the people." Evelyn didn't move. "You've managed people before," she said. "I've worked alongside people," Mason said. "I had a woodworking shop, 4 employees. I never thought of myself as managing them." I thought of myself as the guy who knew how everything worked and was responsible for making sure everyone else knew how to do their jobs without getting hurt. What happened to the shop? He was quiet for a moment. My wife got sick, he said. Stage 3. We caught it late. The treatment ran 14 months. He said it plainly, without performance. It was a fact. It was the fact that had reshaped his entire life. And by now he'd said it enough times that he could deliver it without it collapsing him, though it still cost him something every single time. Insurance covered about 60%. I used the shop's capital to cover the rest. Then I took on debt. Then the debt got bigger. Then He stopped, cleared his throat once. After she passed, there was nothing left. I closed the shop about 3 months later. Evelyn didn't say she was sorry. He appreciated that. People who said I'm sorry usually needed to say it more than he needed to hear it. You have a daughter, she said. Sophie, she's 7. Who's with her now? My neighbor, Mrs. Patel. She watches Sophie on days when I have interviews. He glanced briefly at his watch. She's also watching her through pickup today, in case I ran long. How long have you been doing temporary work? About 1 year and 8 months. What kind? Loading dock at a textile warehouse, first 6 months, then construction site labor. Then I worked about 4 months for a plumbing outfit, not licensed plumbing, structural support work. Right now I'm doing day labor through a dispatch service. Whatever they need. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I'd like to show you something. She led him, wheeling herself down the hall at a pace that made it clear she wasn't waiting for anyone, to a small room adjacent to the HR suite. It looked like a records annex. Filing cabinets, a long table, 3 cardboard banker's boxes stacked against one wall. She stopped beside the table. On it, spread open, was a manila folder with his name on the tab. He recognized it as his application file. His resume was on top. 2 pages, plain formatting, no design flourishes, because he'd read somewhere that simple resumes printed cleaner. The gaps in employment were clearly visible. No college degree, no corporate titles. Just a long sequence of jobs that added up to a man who knew how to build and fix things, interrupted by the long blank space where his life had come apart. But underneath the resume were other papers. He hadn't put those in there. Letters. Hand-addressed. Opened and refolded. He recognized one of them. The return address was the Millbridge Family Shelter on Cascade Avenue. He'd spent 11 days there 2 winters ago. Not as a resident, but because the flooding had damaged the lower level where the children's bedrooms were, and he'd heard about it through a guy at the dispatch yard. He'd driven over, assessed the damage, and spent his off days over the following 2 weeks repairing the drywall, replacing the subflooring, rebuilding 2 bed frames that had warped from the moisture. He hadn't taken any payment. He had his own rent to worry about, and he knew it, but the shelter director had looked so exhausted when she talked about the kids sleeping in the community room. And he was very good at convincing himself that he could afford things he couldn't. He didn't know anyone had written a letter. You sent those? He asked. I requested references from your application, Evelyn said. Your resume listed 2 contact names, former colleagues. I had my team call them, and they gave us 2 more names. Those 2 gave us 3 more. She looked at the stack of letters. We stopped counting at 9. He stared at the letters. You didn't tell anyone about any of this, she said. It wasn't quite a question. No. During the interview this morning, when they asked about your leadership experience, I talked about the shop, not about any of this. He was quiet for a second. It didn't feel like the right context. She looked at him carefully. Didn't feel like the right context, she repeated slowly, as though tasting the phrase. Those weren't professional accomplishments, he said. People needed something and I helped because I could. That's not a resume item. Evelyn looked down at the letters. She picked up one near the bottom of the stack. The paper was slightly yellowed at the fold. She read from it quietly, not performing, just stating, He repaired the heating system in our east wing during the January cold snap without being asked and without accepting any payment. Our residents are elderly. 3 of them were already in medical fragile condition. What Mason Carter did that week was not maintenance work. It was the reason those people stayed warm. She set it down. The room was very quiet. My HR director this morning told me you lacked the credentials to lead a team, she said. He has an MBA from a school I've heard of and 20 years of organizational management experience. She paused. He's also the reason we've had 41 maintenance department resignations in the last 18 months. Mason said nothing. We judged your resume, she said quietly. We never measured your character. She turned the wheelchair to face the window at the end of the hall, the city spread out gray and bright and indifferent below them. I'm not going to pretend I have this all figured out, Mr. Carter. I'm going to be direct with you instead. She turned back. Come back tomorrow. Early. I want you to meet some people, not executives. The people who actually run this building. The mechanics and the electricians and the dock workers. I want to see how you move through a room that doesn't have a conference table in it. He looked at her. That's not an interview, she said. I'm not grading you. I just want to see something. What are you trying to see? She considered the question for a moment with the seriousness it deserved. I want to see if the letters are accurate, she said. He picked up his backpack from the floor beside the table, settled it on his shoulder. The strap held. What time? He asked. 7:30. He nodded. I'll be here. He walked back down the hall toward the elevator, past the executives who were still pretending not to watch, past the reception desk, out through the glass doors and into the cool air of the street. He stood there for a moment. Then he started walking toward the subway. Inside the front pocket of his backpack, folded twice and slightly damp at one corner from the morning's brief rain, was a piece of notebook paper covered in Sophie's handwriting, the careful, uneven letters of a 7-year-old who had been practicing all week. He'd found it tucked into the front of his bag before he left that morning. He hadn't read it until he was on the train. You always fix everything, Dad. He'd folded it back up and held it in his hand for 4 stops. He walked down the subway steps, touched his card to the reader, and got on the train heading north. The train ran express from downtown to the North Side transfer, and Mason spent most of the ride standing near the doors with one hand on the overhead bar, watching the city scroll past the scratched windows. Tunnel, platform, tunnel again. He'd taken this line so many times in the last year and a half that he'd stopped seeing it, the way you stop seeing the wallpaper in a room you live in. The rhythm of it was just background noise now. The compressed hiss of the brakes, the automated voice announcing stops in that flat recorded tone, the press of bodies around him redistributing whenever the doors opened. He was thinking about the letters, not because they surprised him exactly. He remembered the shelter. He remembered the heating system at the Callaway Residence Center that had been a bad January, cold that got into the bones of old buildings and exposed every weakness in the ductwork. And the director there, a soft-spoken man named Earl, had called the dispatch yard looking for someone. Mason had gone out on a Saturday. The job had taken 4 days instead of 1 because the secondary manifold was older than anything he'd worked on before, a cast-iron relic from what looked like the 1960s. And getting the right sealant compound had required 3 hardware store runs. He'd eaten 2 meals in that building's small kitchen over those 4 days. He'd fixed the system. He'd gone home. He hadn't thought of it as something worth documenting. It was just a thing that needed doing. What unsettled him now, riding the express train north with a 7:30 appointment sitting in his chest like something he wasn't sure how to hold, was the realization that Evelyn Sterling had known about those letters before she sent Diane out to the sidewalk after him. She hadn't chased him down on impulse. She had already been building a picture of him from things he'd never thought to mention, from people he barely remembered thanking him in ways he never saw. That was strange. That was the kind of thing that didn't happen to him. His phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. He pulled it out. A number he didn't recognize, area code local. For a half second, his stomach dropped the way it always did when an unknown number came in during school hours. He answered. Mr. Carter? A woman's voice, clipped but not unkind. This is Sandra Rios. I'm the administrative coordinator at Westfield Elementary. Sophie is fine. I want to say that first. She's fine. But she had a little breathing trouble during outdoor recess about 20 minutes ago. The nurse has seen her and she's stable. We've given her the inhaler from her file. She's calm and she's asking for you. Mason was already looking at the map above the doors. He was 4 stops from the North Side transfer. From there, it was 3 stops east on the local line to Westfield. 12, maybe 15 minutes if the transfer was clean. I'm on my way, he said. Tell her I'm on my way. He hung up and looked at his transit card balance on the screen near the door. 40 cents over the base fare. Enough to get there. Enough to get back, barely. He'd figure out the rest. Sophie was sitting in the nurse's office on a padded bench the color of overripe bananas, wrapped in a fleece blanket that was slightly too large for her and had a cartoon dog printed on one corner. The attack had been mild. Mason had learned to read the severity in her posture before anyone said a word. When it was bad, she sat rigid, afraid to move, conserving every breath with a concentration that was terrible to watch in a 7-year-old. Right now she was just tired, slumped. The blanket pooled around her feet. She looked up when he came through the door. "Hi, Dad." "Hey, Bug." He crossed the room and crouched in front of her, put a hand on each side of her face, checked her color, watched her chest rise and fall. Even. Relaxed. "How do you feel?" "Better," she said. "My chest was tight. Mrs. Carver gave me the inhaler." "Good." He exhaled slowly. "You okay now?" "Yeah." She paused. "I kind of fell during relay race first. That's when it started." "Fell? You hurt anywhere?" "Just my knee a little." She pulled the edge of the blanket aside and showed him a scrape on her right knee, already cleaned and covered with a round adhesive bandage printed with small yellow stars. Mrs. Carver put the stars one on. "Good bandage choice," he said. She smiled a little. "I asked for it specifically." The nurse, a solid, gray-haired woman who looked like she'd seen everything twice, appeared from the adjacent room. The episode was moderate at most. Peak flow is back in normal range. She just needs rest this afternoon. No PE, no outdoor time. If you see any tightening again tonight, use the rescue inhaler and call her pulmonologist. "Understood," Mason said. "Thank you." "She's a tough kid," the nurse said it matter-of-factly, not as flattery. Sophie had already pulled a folded piece of paper from the pocket of her school jacket, which was hanging on a hook beside the bench. She held it out to Mason. "I made it in art this morning," she said. "Before the race. I was going to give it to you at pickup." He unfolded it. It was a drawing in crayon, the thick, slightly waxy crayons that came in the big school boxes. The drawing showed two figures standing beneath what was clearly a construction crane, rendered in bright yellow with a hook at the end. One figure was tall, with a backpack. One was small, with what appeared to be either a ponytail or a hat. It was hard to tell. The sky above them was an optimistic blue with a single cloud in one corner. Mason looked at it for a long moment. "We're at a construction site?" he asked. "You're building something big," Sophie said, with the absolute authority of a 7-year-old explaining her own artwork. "And I'm watching, because you always build things." He folded the drawing carefully along its original crease lines and put it in his jacket pocket. "I've got an appointment tomorrow morning," he told her, standing up. 7:30. "I need Mrs. Patel to take you to school." Sophie wrinkled her nose. "The 7:30 one or the other one?" "There's no other one." "You have lots of appointments." "This one might be different," he said. She looked at him with the particular shrewdness that she had developed sometime around her 5th birthday, and which had only intensified since, a look that said she was tracking things adults assumed she wasn't paying attention to. "Different like how?" "Different like I might tell you about it when I know more." "Okay," she said. She pulled the fleece blanket off her shoulders, folded it once, and set it on the bench with a neatness that she had clearly not inherited from him. "Can we have soup tonight?" "Yeah, we can have soup." "The potato kind?" "Sure." "You have to actually put the cheese on top this time, though. Last time you forgot." "I didn't forget," he said. "We were out of cheese." "We should always have cheese," she said firmly. "It's important." He helped her into her jacket. She was steady on her feet, which was the only thing that mattered. Mrs. Patel lived in the apartment directly below theirs in the 4-story walk-up on Dunmore Street, and she had been feeding Sophie soup and opinions about the importance of proper footwear since Sophie was 4 years old. She was in her late 60s, recently widowed, with a lilting accent and a formidable collection of houseplants that had taken over most of her east-facing windows. She babysat Sophie in the particular way of women her age, who had raised their own children a long time ago and found they missed the noise, not as a favor exactly, but as a mutual arrangement that neither of them talked about in terms of need. When Mason brought Sophie back that afternoon, Mrs. Patel met them at the door, took one look at Sophie's face and the star bandage on her knee, and had the girl inside and seated at the kitchen table with a cup of warm ginger water before Mason had finished saying hello. "She had a small episode," he said from his doorway. "I can see that." "Sit down, Mason. You look like you've been running." "I took the train." "Same thing, apparently." She pointed at a chair. He sat down. Sophie was already reaching across the table for the small dish of mixed nuts Mrs. Patel kept there specifically because Sophie liked them, and she claimed they were good for breathing, a theory she had read somewhere and adopted with complete conviction. "I have something tomorrow morning," Mason said. "Early, 7:30. I'd need you to take Sophie to school at 8. "Of course." She said it without looking up from where she was pouring water into a second cup. "What is this appointment?" He considered how to explain it. "I went in for an interview this morning," he said. "Maintenance supervisor job, downtown. A company called Hale Dynamics. And? They rejected me." Mrs. Patel made a short, dismissive sound that communicated her opinion of that decision. "But then," he said slowly, "the CEO sent someone after me, out on the sidewalk. She wanted to talk to me herself." Mrs. Patel set the cup down and looked at him directly. "The CEO?" "Yes." "Of the company that rejected you?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "What kind of CEO?" "She's 30, maybe 31. She uses a wheelchair. Some kind of accident, I think. I didn't ask. She's—" He paused, looking for the right word. "She's sharp. She doesn't waste words." "What did she say?" "She wanted me to come back tomorrow, to meet the people who actually work in the building, not the executives." He rubbed the back of his neck. "She had reference letters from people I've helped over the last couple years. She'd tracked them down through my application." Mrs. Patel was quiet for a moment. Sophie had abandoned the nuts and was drawing something in the corner of a paper napkin with a stubby pencil she'd produced from her jacket pocket. "You think she's serious?" Mrs. Patel said. It wasn't quite a question. "I don't know," Mason said. "I think she's looking for something." "What do you think she's looking for?" He turned the question over. "Something she's not finding in the people she already has." Mrs. Patel picked up both cups and moved them to the table, sitting down across from him with the deliberate economy of movement that she'd had ever since her hip replacement 18 months ago. She didn't complain about it, and she didn't make accommodation for it. She just moved in a way that accounted for it. "When my husband was managing the rail depot," she said, "years ago, he used to say that the people who actually kept the trains running were never the ones with the best titles. They were the ones who showed up early to check the things nobody else checked." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "He said you can always tell who really runs a place by watching who the other workers look at when something breaks." Mason didn't say anything. "You should go tomorrow," she said. "I'm planning to." "Good." She looked at Sophie. "Sophie, eat something real. Those nuts are a snack, not dinner." "I'm not hungry yet," Sophie said without looking up from the napkin. "You will be in 20 minutes, and then it'll be too late for me to cook properly." "Dad said we're having soup." "Your father and I will make soup." Mrs. Patel looked at Mason with the expression of a woman who was about to conscript him into domestic labor and was not presenting it as optional. "You'll stay. Eat something." He stayed. They made soup, the potato kind with cheese, because Mrs. Patel had cheese, and she measured it out in generous amounts because she believed, like Sophie, that it was important. He set the alarm for 5:15. The apartment was quiet when it went off, that particular city at dawn quiet, where the traffic sounds from the street below were still sparse and the pipes hadn't started making their morning noises yet. He lay still for exactly 1 minute, which was a habit he'd developed a long time ago, not hitting snooze, not jumping up, just 1 minute of being horizontal and conscious before the day started requiring things from him. Then he got up. He checked on Sophie through her bedroom door. She was asleep on her side, one arm thrown over the stuffed bear that she'd had since she was 2, and which had lost most of the fiber fill from its left ear, due to years of being gripped during hard nights. Her breathing was easy. He counted 4 cycles before he was satisfied and pulled the door gently back. In the kitchen, he made coffee in the small French press he'd found at a church rummage sale. It was missing the rubber gasket on the plunger, so he'd cut a replacement from a piece of silicone mat, and it worked fine, though it needed more pressure than it should. He drank it standing at the counter, looking at the yellow crane drawing he'd taped to the refrigerator the night before with a piece of electrical tape because they were out of the regular kind. The drawing was slightly off-center on the refrigerator door. He'd put it up without measuring, which was unlike him in his work, but fairly typical in his personal life. He looked at the 2 stick figures, the tall one with the backpack, the small one watching. He thought about what Sophie had said. "You're building something big." He finished the coffee, rinsed the press, and got dressed. His best clothes were not impressive by any reasonable corporate measure, and he was self-aware enough to know it. He had two button-down shirts that he cycled through for interviews. One was light blue, the other a gray-green that Sophie said made him look like a park ranger, which she meant as a compliment, and which he was less certain about. He wore the blue one today, tucked in, with dark slacks that he'd pressed with a damp cloth over a towel, because the iron had stopped working in January and replacing it hadn't been a priority. His boots were work boots, clean, with the scuffs buffed down as much as they'd go. He had one pair of proper dress shoes, but the left sole had separated at the toe, and until he had time to get them resoled, they were unwearable. He looked at himself in the bathroom mirror for about 3 seconds, long enough to register that he looked like what he was, a man who had been through something and was still standing. That would have to be enough. He arrived at Hale Dynamics at 7:18. The lobby was different in the early morning. The overnight cleaning crew had just finished. He could tell by the still damp sheen on the stone floor near the main entrance and the faint chemical smell of the industrial floor cleaner that always lingered for about 40 minutes after application. One of the reception staff was just getting set up at the desk, arranging things with the slightly harried efficiency of someone who'd been in the building for less than 10 minutes. Gus was there. The old janitor was at the east end of the lobby, pushing a dry mop across the area near the elevator bank, and he looked up when Mason came through the main doors. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then Gus raised his chin in that particular silent acknowledgement that working men use between each other. Not quite a nod, not a wave, something in between. Mason returned it. The receptionist directed him to wait near the elevator, and he did, standing off to one side so he wasn't in the way, watching the building wake up. People came through the main entrance in ones and twos, like early arrivals, the kind of employees who got to their desks before the official start of the day. Some of them looked purposeful. Some of them looked like they were still half asleep, running on transit coffee and the obligation of a schedule. At 7:29, Evelyn Sterling came out of the elevator. She was in the same matte black chair as yesterday, dressed differently. A dark jacket, no tie or formal accessories, something more practical about the whole presentation, like she'd made a deliberate decision about the register she wanted to operate in today. She had a paper coffee cup in one hand, which struck him as slightly surprising. I wasn't sure why. Maybe because he'd been around enough executives in the last year of interviews to know that they usually had assistants for the coffee. "You're early," she said. "Habit," he said. "Good habit." She took a drink from the cup. "We're going to the lower levels, sub-basement and level B. That's where the mechanical systems run, HVAC plant, electrical switchgear, loading docks. Most of the building management team works out of there." "Okay. I'm going to introduce you. After that, I'm mostly going to step back and let you move around." She looked at him steadily. "Don't perform. I don't need to see you trying to impress anyone. I just need to see what happens when you're in a room with people who know their work." "That's a strange thing to have to tell someone," he said. "You'd be surprised how many people can't do it," she said. They took the service elevator down. The sub-basement of Hale Dynamics was a different world from the lobby above. Lower ceilings, exposed conduit running along the concrete walls in color-coded bundles. The hum of large machinery underlying everything like a bass note you felt more than heard. The air was cooler and smelled like metal and hydraulic fluid and the particular dry heat that came off electrical switchgear that had been running without interruption for a long time. Fluorescent strips ran overhead, supplemented by work lights clamped to conduit brackets in the areas where the fixed lighting didn't reach. There were 8 people in the main floor area when Evelyn and Mason came through the heavy fire door from the service corridor. They registered Evelyn with the automatic awareness that people in subordinate positions always have for where their boss is in a room, and they registered Mason with the more measured assessment that working people apply to strangers, sizing him up without being obvious about it, reading his clothes, his hands, his posture. "This is Mason Carter," Evelyn said. "He's spending the morning with you. Show him what you're working on." She said it simply, like it was a normal thing, and then she moved off to one side and parked her chair beside a structural column with a clear sightline to the whole floor. A broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s with a gray-streaked beard and grease on the back of his left forearm crossed his arms and looked at Mason directly. His name tag read Breckenridge, L. Lead Mech. "You worked mechanical systems before?" Breckenridge asked. Woodworking shop, Mason said. HVAC, plumbing, electrical, all self-taught, mostly because I couldn't afford contractors. What kind of shop? Furniture, custom pieces, some restoration work. I had a 40-year-old compressed air system I kept running for about 6 years past its service date. Breckenridge's expression shifted slightly. Not a smile exactly, more like the narrowing of assessment. How? Carefully, Mason said. The big man uncrossed his arms. Come look at something. The loading dock issue had apparently been accumulating for the better part of 4 months. It was a roll-up freight door on the north end, one of 3 serving the building's receiving area, and it had developed an intermittent failure where the drive mechanism would hesitate at the 3/4 open position before either completing the cycle or reversing unexpectedly. Nobody had been hurt, yet, but the potential was obvious, and the third-party maintenance contractor the building used had sent out 2 technicians across 2 separate visits who had replaced the limit switch and the tension spring on the counterbalance assembly without resolving the problem. Breckenridge walked Mason through the basics while a younger guy, mid-20s, first name Ray, the kind of young worker who positioned himself at the edge of conversations with senior people because he was still learning how to be in rooms, watched from a short distance. Mason crouched down at the base of the drive unit housing and looked at it for a long moment without touching anything. They replaced the limit switch, he said. Twice, Breckenridge said. Mason stood and walked the full length of the door track on both sides, looking up at the guide rollers. Then he stopped at the upper left quadrant and pointed. Third roller from the top on this side. Look at the mounting bracket. Breckenridge moved in beside him and looked. Ray drifted a half step closer. It's not the mount that's the problem, Mason said. But look at the wear pattern on the roller itself. One side is worn down more than the other. That means the door is running slightly out of true. It's torquing just a fraction every cycle. The limit switch reads the door position, but because there's a rotational variance in the load, you're getting inconsistent trigger pressure. The switch isn't broken, it just can't compensate for a door that isn't running straight. Breckenridge was quiet for a moment. The track alignment on that side, he said slowly. Upper anchor bolts, Mason said. My bet is one of them worked itself loose at some point. Vibration, thermal cycling, and nobody caught it because from the ground you can't see it without a lift, and the door was still mostly functional, so nobody went looking. He straightened up. If I'm wrong, you'll find out in 15 minutes. If I'm right, you reseat those bolts and balance the track, and the limit switch starts reading clean. Breckenridge looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Ray. Get the lift. Ray was already moving. It took 22 minutes because getting the lift positioned properly took longer than expected, and one of the upper anchor bolts required an impact driver to break free. But Mason was right. The bolt on the inside upper anchor had backed out almost 3 full turns from its specified torque. Breckenridge reseated it, checked the companion bolt, adjusted the track alignment by 4 millimeters, and cycled the door 7 times in a row. Smooth, all the way, every time. Nobody made a big deal about it. That was the thing about working people. They didn't applaud in work environments the way executives applauded in conference rooms. What Breckenridge did was look at Mason for a moment and say, "Good eye," in a tone that communicated considerably more than the words themselves, and Mason understood that and just nodded. Ray, the young worker, had a different response. Hung back until Breckenridge moved off to start logging the repair and the maintenance record, then appeared at Mason's elbow with the slightly rigid posture of someone working up to saying something. That was the problem the whole time, Ray said. That was the problem, Mason said. The contractors came out twice. Contractors bill by the part they replace, Mason said. If you replace the obvious component and the problem persists, sometimes the incentive isn't quite there to dig deeper. He paused. That's not me saying they were cutting corners on purpose. Sometimes you see what you expect to see. It takes someone coming in fresh to look at it sideways. Ray turned this over. How do you know when to look sideways? Mason thought about it honestly. When the obvious answer has already been tried, he said. After that, you stop looking at the broken thing and start looking at everything around it. Ray nodded slowly, like he was filing it away somewhere useful. The morning moved in a way that Mason hadn't experienced in a long time, absorbed, without the background hum of anxiety that had underscored most of his days for the last 2 years. He wasn't performing. He wasn't tracking how he was being perceived. He was just moving through a working space, talking to people who knew their jobs, noticing things, asking questions when he didn't know something, and answering them when he did. He met the electricians, a pair of women in their 30s who were running a new circuit to the server room expansion and had a running disagreement about the most efficient conduit routing that they were happy to bring him into as an outside perspective. He talked to the paint crew supervisor, a quiet man named Ortega, who had been with the building for 11 years and who walked Mason through a moisture intrusion issue on the northeast stairwell that had been defying explanation since the spring. Mason looked at the staining pattern and the location and asked 3 questions about the HVAC intake vent on the exterior wall 2 floors above, and something clicked in Ortega's expression that suggested he was going to be making a phone call after Mason left. He had a cup of terrible coffee from the break room machine, the kind that came out of a foil pack system that was 3 filter changes overdue and tasted like someone had described coffee to a person who had only ever heard about it secondhand. He drank all of it because the room was cold and the cup was warm, and that was reason enough. Around 10:30, Breckenridge found him in the corridor near the secondary mechanical room and stood there for a moment, not quite blocking the way. "Where'd you work before the shop?" Breckenridge asked. "Construction. Factory line for a few years when I was young. Did a stint on a maintenance crew for a hotel chain, commercial systems. That was good experience." Mason paused. "After the shop closed, I've been doing day labor, mostly." "Day labor?" Breckenridge said it in a flat tone that wasn't judgment exactly, but acknowledged the distance between what Mason clearly knew and where he currently was. "Yeah." "That's a waste," Breckenridge said simply. Mason didn't answer. He wasn't sure what to say to that. "I've been here 9 years," Breckenridge said. "We've had 4 different department managers in that time, 2 from outside, 2 promoted internally. None of them could have told you what was wrong with that door." He wasn't saying it as a compliment. He was saying it as a statement of record, laying out a fact that had weight in his professional world. "We've got good people down here, but the communication, from this floor to the decision-makers upstairs, it's been broken for a long time. Things don't get fixed because the people who know what needs fixing can't get anyone above them to listen." "That's a common problem," Mason said. "Yeah." Breckenridge looked at him. "You think you could talk to the people upstairs?" "I don't know," Mason said honestly. "I've never tried." "Would you try?" Mason was quiet for a moment. "I'd try." Breckenridge nodded once. Then he went back to the mechanical room and Mason stood in the corridor for a moment, listening to the building hum around him, all its systems running, all its hidden complications turning over quietly in the dark of the lower floors, keeping the tower above alive and functioning without a single person in the glass offices above ever thinking about it. I was still thinking about what Breckenridge had said. "That's a waste," when he heard the elevator door open at the end of the service corridor and Evelyn Sterling's chair came rolling through with the quiet efficiency of someone who had timed her reappearance with some precision. She stopped a few feet away from him. "How are you doing?" she asked. "Fine," he said. Then more honestly, "I fixed a freight door, had some coffee. I think I might know why Ortega's stairwell is getting moisture." Ortega mentioned. She looked at him in that direct reading way she had. "What do you think of the team?" He didn't hesitate. "They're good. Experienced. They care about the work." He paused. "They're frustrated." "Why?" "Because nobody above them is listening to what they're saying about what actually needs to be done. So they fix what they can fix, and they stop reporting the rest. Because reporting means filling out forms that go to people who don't understand what they're reading." He looked at her directly. "That's not a maintenance problem. That's a communication problem, and it goes both ways." Evelyn said nothing for a moment. The hum of the building surrounded them both. The patient, constant sound of systems doing their work in the dark. "Come upstairs," she said. "I want to show you something." The elevator that served the upper floors of Hale Dynamics was a different animal from the service elevator. Wider, quieter, with a polished interior panel and a floor indicator that used soft amber digits instead of the green industrial readout below. Mason stood to one side while Evelyn positioned her chair facing the doors. Neither of them spoke on the way up. The building hummed faintly through the floor. I was still thinking about what Breckenridge had said. "That's a waste." 3 words from a man who used language economically, which meant those 3 words carried the weight of a longer sentence. Mason had heard variations of it before, from the plumbing outfit foreman who'd told him he was overqualified for structural support labor, from the textile warehouse shift lead who'd offered him a line supervisor slot 6 weeks in and seemed genuinely baffled when circumstances forced Mason to decline because Sophie's school schedule didn't accommodate the shift change. People told him he was wasted in the wrong rooms, and then the conversation ended and nothing changed, because the gap between a compliment and an opportunity was, in Mason's experience, almost always larger than it looked. He didn't know if this was different. He was trying not to decide that yet. The elevator opened on the 14th floor, which was not the executive level. That was the 17th, he knew from the directory board in the lobby. The 14th held what appeared to be a combination of mid-level management offices and a large open workspace that looked recently reconfigured, the kind of floor that had been rearranged multiple times in the last few years as headcount shifted, leaving behind a faint archaeology of former arrangements in the carpetware patterns and the ghost outlines of removed partition walls. Evelyn led him to a corner conference room with a long rectangular table and windows on two sides, north and east, which meant the morning light came through clean and direct this time of day, laying bright rectangles across the table's surface. On the table were several documents in neat stacks, not manila folders, larger format printouts, building floor plans, what appeared to be equipment inventories, some kind of organizational chart printed on oversized paper and folded in thirds. She positioned herself at the head of the table and waited while he took a seat, not at the far end, he noted, but 2 chairs down from her, which left the space between them conversational rather than formal. "I want to show you what I'm dealing with," she said. She pulled the top document from the nearest stack and turned it to face him. It was the organizational chart. Unfolded, it covered most of the table between them, a branching structure with hail dynamics at the top and the facilities division rendered in the lower right quadrant, a dense cluster of boxes connected by lines that had clearly been revised several times, some boxes with names, some with titles only, some blank. "This is the current facilities and operations structure," she said, "or what's left of it." Mason looked at it. The blank boxes stood out. There were more of them than there should have been for a building this size and complexity. "How many people have you lost in the last 2 years?" he asked. 41 resignations from the facilities division since January of last year, she said. Of those, 12 were senior level or lead positions. Breckenridge has been carrying the mechanical lead responsibilities alone for the last 5 months because his co-lead quit in April, and we haven't been able to fill the role. Why not? Because the candidates who come in at that level see the turnover numbers during due diligence, and they don't take the offer, she said, which is rational behavior on their part. She tapped the organizational chart with one finger. The problem isn't compensation. We've adjusted the salary ranges twice in 18 months. The problem is that this division has no functional culture. People come in, they don't feel connected to anything above them, they don't feel heard, and they leave. She paused. The man who was managing this division before the last reorganization, his name was Garrett, he'd been with the company 11 years, he resigned 8 months ago. He told me in his exit interview that he spent the last 2 years of his tenure translating between people who spoke completely different languages and getting ignored by both sides. Mason was quiet for a moment, looking at the chart. What happened to the person before Garrett? Retired early, medical leave that became permanent. She said it without elaboration, but her tone placed it in a category of outcomes that spoke for themselves. And before that? Before that was a period of relatively stable management under the previous ownership structure, she said. Before I took over. He looked up. How long have you been CEO? 3.5 years. And the wheelchair? He asked it directly because indirect questions were slower and they both seemed to dislike slow. She didn't appear to mind. 4 years ago, she said. Highway accident. I was in the car, not driving. Thoracic spinal injury. Incomplete, which means some function below the level of injury but not full. She said it in the same register he used when he talked about Claire. Factual, contained, the kind of delivery that had been refined through many tellings until it fit into a sentence without spilling over the edges. I was in rehabilitation when the board approached me about the CEO position. My predecessor was stepping down. I'd been the COO for 2 years. You took the CEO job while you were in rehab. I took the CEO job 6 weeks after the accident, she said. I ran the first board meeting from a hospital-grade reclining chair because my chair hadn't been fitted yet. She looked at him calmly. People thought it was reckless. I thought it was the only thing that was going to keep me from losing my mind. He understood that completely, actually. Not the specific circumstance, but the shape of it. The way work could be the rope that kept you tethered when everything else was coming apart. He'd rebuilt a neighbor's back fence 2 weeks after Claire's funeral because he needed to do something with his hands, needed to measure and cut and drive nails, needed a problem that had a solution he could reach with tools he knew how to use. He didn't say any of that, but something in his expression must have registered because she looked at him for a moment in a different way. The way people look at each other when they recognize, without words, that they've traveled through similar kinds of darkness by different roads. She turned back to the chart. I need someone to rebuild this, she said. Not the org chart, the actual division, the people in it and the way they relate to each other and to the rest of the company. She smoothed the paper once, a habitual gesture. I've hired managers with strong credentials for this role. They come in, they implement systems, they produce reports. The numbers look better on paper for a quarter or two, and then the turnover continues because the systems don't actually touch the thing that's broken. What's broken? Mason asked. Trust, she said. The people in that sub-basement don't trust that anyone above them cares what they think. They don't trust that a problem reported will be a problem addressed. They've been managed, measured, and reorganized enough times that when a new face shows up with new ideas, the default response is to wait it out. She looked at him. You've been down there for 3 hours. How did they respond to you? He thought about it honestly. Cautiously, he said. Breckenridge tested me on the door problem before he decided to engage. The electricians were friendly but watching. Ortega didn't volunteer anything. I had to ask the right questions before he'd let me into the stairwell issue. He paused. Ray was the most open, but he's young enough that he hasn't learned to protect himself yet. That's an accurate read, she said. You got further in 3 hours than our last 2 department heads got in their first month. Because I wasn't their department head, Mason said. I was just someone who knew about freight doors. She looked at him steadily. That's exactly the point. He left the building at 12:40. He had a dispatch call at 2 o'clock, a loading yard in the warehouse district that needed 2 extra bodies for an afternoon shift moving inventory ahead of an inspection. 8 hours at the day rate, which after transit costs would net him enough for groceries through the weekend and a portion of the electric bill that was currently 10 days past its due date. He'd already called ahead to let them know he'd be slightly late arriving, which they'd accepted with the particular tolerant indifference of dispatch coordinators, who were used to the logistics of people who didn't have cars. On the subway heading south, he sat this time, found a seat near the end of a car, put the backpack on his knees, and let the tunnel light strobe past the window. The morning replayed in his head with the non-linear quality that important mornings sometimes had, where the sequence of events was less clear than the individual moments that had cut deepest. Breckenridge's face when the door cycled clean. 7 times. Ray asking how you know when to look sideways. The blank boxes on that organizational chart, each one a person who had decided that this particular situation wasn't worth staying for. Evelyn saying, the problem isn't compensation. He'd worked enough jobs and been through enough failed attempts at improving bad situations to know that she was right about that. Money helped. Money fixed the immediate crisis. But money didn't make a person feel like what they did mattered. Money didn't make you want to come in early, or stay late, or go out of your way for a colleague. Those things came from something else. Something harder to name and significantly harder to build, and you couldn't manufacture it with a policy document or an org chart revision. It either existed in a place or it didn't, and when it didn't, you could feel its absence the moment you walked through the door. In the way people moved, in the way they communicated, in the quality of the silence between the things they said out loud and the things they'd stopped bothering to say. He'd felt it this morning in the sub-basement. Not the absence, the remnant. There was something left down there. Breckenridge, Ortega, the electricians, they still cared about the work even after being systematically ignored by the people above them. That kind of stubborn professional integrity didn't survive in a place that was entirely broken. It survived where people had once been given a reason to care and hadn't fully let go of it even after the reason disappeared. That was something to build on. He stopped the thought. He was getting ahead of himself. Nothing had been offered. He didn't have a job. He had a 2 o'clock dispatch call and an electric bill. The afternoon shift at the loading yard was the kind of physical work that emptied the mind, which Mason usually appreciated. 8 hours of moving palletized inventory, 40-pound cartons, shoulder height, stack and wrap and move, left the body informed of its own existence in a way that had its own particular satisfaction when you were finished and considerably less satisfaction when you were 43 and your lower back had opinions. He worked beside a man named Dwight, who was about 60, big through the shoulders, but slowing down the way strong men do when time starts to argue with the muscles they spent decades building up. Dwight had been doing day labor dispatch work for 3 years, since his last full-time position at a food distribution plant had been eliminated in a restructuring. He was methodical and economical in his movement. He didn't waste energy, he didn't rush, and he never stopped moving. Mason had worked alongside him twice before at different sites, and they'd fallen into an easy rhythm that didn't require much conversation. Around 6 o'clock, during a 10-minute break, Dwight sat on the edge of a pallet wrap station with a water bottle and looked at Mason. "You look like you're thinking about something that isn't this place," Dwight said. "Had an unusual morning," Mason said. "Good unusual or bad unusual?" "I don't know yet." Dwight drank his water. "Job interview?" "Sort of." Mason leaned against the shelf unit behind him, feeling the pull in his lower back that he'd been managing since the 3rd hour. "Company called Hale Dynamics, downtown." Dwight was quiet for a moment in a way that suggested he was doing something with that information. "The Sterling Company? You know it?" "I know of it," Dwight said. "My nephew works a delivery route that covers their district. He says the building's some kind of landmark. Glass and concrete, big atrium." He paused. "Sterling's the woman in the wheelchair, right? Young. Took over from her father's old partner or something." "I don't know the ownership history," Mason said. "So what kind of unusual?" Mason considered how much to say. Dwight was not a man who asked questions he didn't intend to think about, which meant the answer deserved some care. "They rejected me for a maintenance supervisor role in the morning. Then the CEO called me back herself and spent the morning letting me walk the facility." He paused. "I think she might be building to an offer. I don't know what kind." Dwight was quiet for a moment. "She watch you work, or did she tell you what to do?" "Watched." "Then she's serious," Dwight said simply. "You sound certain." "People who aren't serious tell you what to do," Dwight said. "People who are serious watch first." He screwed the cap back on the water bottle. "What'd you find down there?" "Freight door problem nobody else had figured out. Moisture issue in a stairwell. Bunch of experienced people who've stopped being listened to." Dwight nodded once, slowly, like that was the answer he expected. "That's every building," he said. "Every company, every institution. Same thing everywhere. The people who actually know what's broken get tuned out by the people who write reports about what's broken. And then somebody gets surprised when the whole thing falls apart." He stood up, straightened his back with a careful deliberateness. "You'd be good at fixing that, Mason." "You've never seen me manage anything." "I've worked beside you 4 times, Dwight said. "You listen before you talk and you finish what you start, and when something goes wrong, you go toward it instead of away from it." He picked up his work gloves from the shelf edge. "That's not nothing." The break ended. They went back to work. He picked Sophie up from Mrs. Patel's at 7:15. Sophie had eaten dinner there, chicken rice, which was Mrs. Patel's default weeknight meal, and which Sophie claimed to love, but Mason suspected she loved more because it came with the small television in the kitchen, tuned to the nature documentary channel, than because of the food itself. She was full and slightly drowsy, and recounted the afternoon in a loose, half-asleep narration that covered a disagreement with a classmate named Theo, the nature documentary which had apparently been about migratory birds, and a joke she'd heard from Mrs. Patel that she admitted she didn't entirely understand but had laughed at anyway. In the apartment, Mason ran her bath, checked her breathing once, still easy, good color, and sat on the edge of the tub while she negotiated the exact temperature of the water with the tap, which was a nightly process that took longer than it should have. "Dad," she said, without looking up from the tap. "Yeah." "Did the 7:30 appointment go okay?" He looked at her for a moment. She was 7, and she asked follow-up questions with the patience and precision of someone who had learned that adults often forgot to close loops. "It went okay," he said. "Did you build something?" He thought about that. "Not yet," he said. "Maybe." She looked up at him then. Her hair was half out of its braid from the day, and she had a small ink mark on her left wrist that had probably come from the marker she'd been drawing with at Mrs. Patel's. She looked at him with that clear, uncomplicated assessment that children her age were still capable of before the world taught them to screen it. "You should do it," she said, "if you can build something." "I don't know exactly what I'd be building yet." "That's okay," she said. "You always figure that out when you start." He looked at her. "Bath time," he said. The call came the following morning at 8:47. He was in the kitchen making Sophie's lunch, the usual, half sandwich, apple slices, the specific crackers she preferred because of some textural preference she'd had since age 5, and which remained non-negotiable, when his phone lit up on the counter. Evelyn Sterling. He'd added her name to the contact after she'd called him the day of the interview. He answered. "Mr. Carter, are you available to come in this morning?" "I have a dispatch shift at noon," he said. "I can come in before." "I only need an hour, 9:30. "I can do that." "Good." A brief pause. "I've spoken with Breckenridge and Ortega and a few others from yesterday." He waited. "I'd like to have a real conversation," she said, "about what I want to offer you. I want to do that in person." Another pause, shorter. "Is that all right?" "Yes," he said. He finished Sophie's lunch on autopilot. Sandwich, apple, crackers, the small note he tucked into the corner of her lunchbox that he'd been doing every day since she started school. Just a line or two, nothing elaborate, because his mother had done it for him, and he'd never gotten around to deciding whether it was something he was going to keep doing or stop doing, and so it continued. Today's note said, "Fixed a big door yesterday. Working on something bigger. Love, Dad." He dropped Sophie at school at 8:15, walked back to the apartment, changed into the blue shirt, looked at himself in the bathroom mirror again. Same man as yesterday. Holes in his biography, dirt under the edges of his fingernails that didn't entirely come out, no matter how carefully he scrubbed. A left bootlace that had been retied at the midpoint because it had snapped there 2 months ago, and he'd knotted it rather than replaced it. He pulled his jacket on and left. Evelyn had moved the meeting to her office on the 17th floor, which was different from the conference rooms he'd seen. Smaller than he expected, with less of the architectural performance that executive offices usually went in for. The desk was large but functional, covered in working documents, rather than the decorative arrangements that were meant to project authority. One wall was entirely glass, looking west over the city. The opposite wall had a whiteboard covered in handwriting, diagrams, notations, something that looked like a rough timeline that had clearly been up for a while, built over multiple sessions, the kind of wall writing that was part of an ongoing conversation with a problem rather than a presentation of a solution. He looked at the whiteboard while she finished a short phone call at her desk. 2 minutes, clipped, something about a supplier contract. She handled it without apparent stress and hung up without pleasantries. "Sit down," she said. "Sorry about that." He sat. He'd been in this chair in his head already during the train ride over, running through the variables. He knew, roughly, what might be coming. He didn't know whether he was ready for it. He wasn't sure readiness was the right frame. "I talked to Breckenridge for about 40 minutes last night," Evelyn said. She pulled a single sheet of paper from the corner of her desk and set it facing him. He said, and I'm going to quote this accurately because it's not the kind of thing he says, "That man knew what was wrong with the door in less time than it took me to explain the problem. More importantly, he knew how to talk to Ray." Mason looked at the paper. It was a job description, not printed from a template, typed and reformatted, the margins uneven in a way that said it had been reworked several times in the last day or two. "Breckenridge mentioned Ray specifically?" he said. "Ray Suarez is 24, Evelyn said. He's been with the facilities team for 7 months. He's technically very capable. Breckenridge says he picks up mechanical concepts faster than anyone he's trained in years. But he's been struggling with confidence, and the previous management environment made it worse. He made a significant error his second month, damaged a piece of calibration equipment, and the way it was handled by the department head at the time was..." She paused. "Not constructive." Mason thought about Ray at the edge of the conversation. The rigid posture, the way he positioned himself to learn without fully committing to being seen. He thought about what he'd told him. "The mistake isn't failing, it's pretending you didn't," which he'd said without thinking, because it was just true. It was something he'd learned from his own ruined woodworking project, a shelving commission he'd miscalculated the load distribution on and had to entirely rebuild at his own cost. "He asked you something afterward?" Evelyn said. "About how to know when to look at a problem sideways," Mason said. "What did you tell him?" "When the obvious answer has already been tried." He paused. "And to stop looking at the broken thing and start looking at everything around it." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Breckenridge said the kid looked like he was writing that down in his head. Mason didn't say anything. "Look at the description," Evelyn said. He looked at it. The title at the top was not maintenance supervisor. It was Director of Facilities, Culture, and Operations. He read the description slowly. It was unusual for a corporate job posting, less focused on credentials and reporting structures than on outcomes. The language was blunt in places in a way that suggested whoever had written it was not using a template. Rebuild functional trust between the facilities division and company leadership. Create conditions where experienced workers feel heard and newer workers feel supported. Solve the turnover problem not through incentive programs, but through cultural change. That exact phrase, cultural change. As though whoever wrote it understood the difference between putting new wallpaper over a damaged wall and actually addressing what was underneath. He set the paper down. "You wrote this yourself," he said. "Last night," she said, "after I talked to Breckenridge." He looked at her. "This is a significant position." "Yes." "I've never held a corporate title. I've never managed a department. I've never sat in a leadership meeting or written a budget proposal or navigated an executive structure." He said it plainly, not as self-deprecation, but as honest inventory. "Those are gaps." "I know what your gaps are," she said. "I've been thinking about them." "And?" "Some of them we can close with support. Diane can walk you through the administrative systems, and I have a director of operations who can mentor you on the budget and procurement processes. Those are learnable things." She folded her hands on the desk. "The things I can't teach are already there. I watched Breckenridge, who has trusted approximately nobody in management for the better part of 4 years, voluntarily brief me on your assessment of that door problem with something that looked like professional respect. I watched Ortega go back and re-examine that stairwell on his own initiative based on questions you asked. Those things don't happen because of credentials." Mason was quiet. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I'm thinking about the 41 people who left," he said. She waited. "Some of those people left because the environment was bad," he said. "But some of them left because they stopped believing it could be different. And they were right at the time. It couldn't be different at the time, but if something changes—" He stopped. "The people who are still there, Breckenridge, Ortega, they've been let down before, more than once. If I take this and I get it wrong, or I get it right halfway, and then the conditions above change, that's not just a management failure. Those people trusted something again, and it didn't hold." Evelyn was very still. "I know," she said. "That's the actual risk," he said, "not whether I can figure out the administrative systems." "I know," she said again. "That's why I'm not offering this to someone who doesn't understand that it's the actual risk." She looked at him directly. "The question isn't whether you can fail them. Anybody can fail anybody. The question is whether you'll try hard enough and honestly enough that if you do fail, it's not because you stopped caring." He looked at the job description again. The whiteboard behind her showed the timeline she'd been building. Rough phases, arrows, notations he couldn't fully read from this angle. Someone had been planning this for longer than the last 48 hours. "How long have you been thinking about restructuring this division?" he asked. 8 months, she said, "since Garrett left." "And in 8 months you've interviewed how many people for a role like this?" She paused for just a half second. "None." He looked at her. "I didn't know what I was looking for," she said, "until I saw something I wasn't expecting." He thought about a broken cleaning cart, a 7-year-old janitor struggling with a wheel that wouldn't track, a moment that took 4 minutes and hadn't felt like anything except the obvious thing to do. He looked at the job description. He thought about the electric bill that was 10 days overdue. He thought about Sophie's prescription refill that was due at the end of the month. He thought about the dispatch yard and Dwight moving pallets with his careful, slowing, too-good-for-this-work efficiency. And the way Dwight had said, "That's every building," with the quiet resignation of a man who understood the problem too well to be surprised by it anymore. He thought about Breckenridge, about Ray standing at the edge of the conversation, writing things down in his head. He thought about Claire, who had told him once, during one of the bad weeks, one of the weeks where the medical bills arrived and the shop accounts were running thin, and he'd come home and sat at the kitchen table for too long without talking. She'd told him, "You're not meant for small problems, Mason. You just keep getting put in front of them." He picked up the job description. "Walk me through what support looks like," he said. "The actual structure. Who I report to, who has authority over the division budget, what I can and can't change without going upstairs." Something shifted in Evelyn's expression. Not quite relief, not satisfaction. Something quieter and more careful than either of those. "Let's go through it," she said. She pulled a second document from the corner of her desk. Outside the windows, the city spread westward in the late morning light. Gray at the edges, bright at the center, the way cities always looked from above, as though the life inside them was generating its own heat. Mason read the document. He read it carefully, the way he read anything that mattered, the way he would have read a blueprint for a structure he was about to stake his tools and his reputation on building. Looking for the load-bearing elements, looking for what would hold, looking for the places where the design was optimistic in ways that reality might not support. He asked 11 questions over the next 50 minutes. Evelyn answered each one without flinching, and when there were things she didn't have answers for, she said so, open items, and kept going. It was the most productive meeting Mason had been in for as long as he could remember, which said something about every meeting he'd been in for the last 2 years and something different about this one. When they were finished, Evelyn looked at him. "I need to be at a noon board call," she said. "I don't want to rush you on this. Take a day." "I don't need a day," he said. She looked at him carefully. "I need to make one call," he said. "My neighbor. She watches my daughter. If this job changes my schedule significantly, she needs to know before I say yes to anything." He stood up, folded the job description, and put it in his jacket pocket next to Sophie's crane drawing, which was still there from yesterday. "And I need to cancel a dispatch shift." Evelyn didn't move for a moment. Then quietly, "Is that a yes, Mr. Carter?" He looked at her. "It's close to a yes," he said honestly. "Make the call on your end and I'll make the call on mine, and we'll talk this afternoon." He picked up the backpack from beside the chair. The nylon strap he'd rewoven held exactly as it always did. Well enough, not perfectly, which was the condition of most things in his life and which he had long since stopped fighting. He walked to the elevator, pressed the button, waited. From down the hall, through the open office door, he could hear Evelyn already on a call. Not the noon board meeting, something else, something quick. Her voice carrying that flat, even authority that he was starting to recognize as her particular register for when she had already decided something and was communicating it outward rather than deliberating. The elevator came. He got in. He pulled out his phone and looked at the dispatch number in his recent calls list. Noon shift. 40-pound cartons. 8 hours. He thought about the whiteboard in Evelyn's office. The timeline. The phases. The arrows pointing somewhere she'd been building toward for 8 months without knowing what the missing piece looked like. He dialed Mrs. Patel. She answered on the second ring. "Mason," she said, "you're calling in the middle of the morning. What happened?" "I think I need to talk to you about a schedule change," he said. There was a short pause. "Hold on," she said. "Let me sit down. This sounds like it's going to be a real conversation." "It might be," he said. "Good," she said firmly. "It's about time." The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened onto the clean stone floor, the real plants, the arc of pale birch at the reception desk. Gus was at the far end with his cart, moving at the measured pace of a man who knew exactly how much work there was and wasn't going to burn himself out before half of it was done. He caught Mason's eye across the lobby and raised his chin. That same wordless acknowledgement from yesterday morning, the one that passed between working men without requiring a name for itself. Mason returned it. He walked out through the glass doors into the air of the street, phone at his ear, Mrs. Patel's voice warm and practical and immediate on the other end. And behind him the doors of Hale Dynamics sighed quietly shut. Mrs. Patel listened without interrupting, which was not her natural mode. She was, under ordinary circumstances, a woman who asked clarifying questions in real time, threading her thoughts into the conversation as it moved. The fact that she went quiet and stayed quiet for the full 3 minutes, it took Mason to explain, told him she understood this was not a casual update. He stood on the sidewalk outside Hale Dynamics with the morning traffic building around him, and he laid it out plainly. The title, the scope, the salary figure. Evelyn had written at the bottom of the second document, the medical insurance that would cover Sophie's pulmonologist appointments and prescription refills without Mason doing the monthly calculation of which bill he could delay to cover the copay. He said it all in the flat, careful tone he used when he was describing something that mattered too much to dramatize. When he finished, Mrs. Patel was quiet for another few seconds. Then she said, "How much did you say the salary was?" He told her again. Another pause. "Mason, I know. That's real money. I know. And medical for Sophie. Full coverage. Her pulmonologist is in the network." The line was quiet long enough that he checked his phone screen to make sure the call was still connected. "You're not asking me if you should take it," Mrs. Patel said finally. It wasn't a question. She was naming what she'd heard in his voice. "No," he said. "I already know what I'm going to do. I'm calling because the schedule will change and you need to know what that looks like before I say yes." "What does it look like?" "Longer days to start," he said. "I'd need Sophie in school by 8 and picked up by whoever's available at 3:15. I try to make pickup myself most days, but there'll be days I can't." He paused. "I can pay you properly now. I want to." "We can talk about that later," she said, in a tone that suggested she intended to be difficult about accepting money, and he should prepare himself for that negotiation separately. "Sophie is fine. I like having her. You know that." A short pause. "Go say yes, Mason. Call me afterward." He stood there for a moment after she hung up, the phone warm in his hand, the city moving past him with its complete indifference to the fact that something had just shifted. He went back inside. The formal offer conversation lasted 40 minutes. Evelyn had the contract prepared, not a final signed version, a working draft with specific paragraphs tabbed, because she was the kind of person who anticipated the questions and flagged the relevant sections before they were asked for. They sat across from each other in the 17th floor office again, the city light moving on the west windows as the morning continued, and Mason read every page at the pace he actually needed to read it, which was slower than the pace that would have seemed appropriately decisive in a movie version of this moment. She didn't rush him. She answered the questions he had. 3 of them, all specific, all about what happened in scenarios where something went wrong, rather than scenarios where everything went right, because those were the questions that told you whether a contract was written in good faith. The answers were satisfactory. Not perfect. One clause about performance review timelines was vague in a way he didn't love, but he said so, and she made a note and said she'd have legal clarify it before the final version. He signed the working draft with the understanding that the legal revisions would be incorporated. His hand was steady when he signed it. He noticed that, in the removed way you notice things about yourself when you're watching from a slight distance. Afterward, Evelyn sat back in her chair and looked at him with an expression that was more complex than simple satisfaction. There was relief in it, and something that looked like the particular tiredness that comes after a long effort finally resolved, and underneath both of those something else, something more guarded, that he couldn't fully name. "I want to tell you something," she said. "That isn't in the contract." He waited. "When I sent Diane after you on Tuesday morning," she said, "I didn't know what I was going to offer you. I just knew I couldn't watch you walk away and not find out what was in those letters." She paused. "I've been running this company for 3.5 years, and the facilities division has been the problem I couldn't solve the whole time. I've hired consultants, I've commissioned studies, I've done restructuring exercises that cost more than your new annual salary and changed nothing that mattered." She looked at the window. "And then I'm standing on a second-floor balcony, and I watch a man who just got rejected stop and fix a stranger's cart and gather his papers off the floor, and I think, that's it. That's what's been missing." She looked back at him. Not the skill, the instinct. Mason was quiet for a moment. "You took a risk," he said. "You don't actually know if I can do this job." "No," she agreed. "I don't." "That doesn't bother you?" "It bothers me considerably," she said, with a directness that he respected. "But the alternative is continuing to hire people I'm confident about and watching them fail at the things that matter. At some point, that pattern stops being the candidate's failure and becomes mine." He picked up his copy of the draft contract, folded it, put it in his jacket pocket. It sat there alongside the folded crane drawing, which was now acquiring the soft, worn texture of paper that had been handled often. "When do you want me to start?" he asked. "Monday," she said. "That gives you the rest of the week to close out whatever you need to close out." He nodded. "I was thinking about the dispatch yard, about Dwight, about the professional courtesy of not leaving them short-handed without notice." He'd called the dispatch coordinator this afternoon. "One more thing," Evelyn said. He looked at her. "Gus," she said, "the janitor you helped in the lobby. What about him?" "He's been with this building for 14 years, she said. "He knows more about the physical history of this facility than anyone currently on the payroll, where the original systems are, what modifications were made and when, which contractor work was done properly and which was cut short. He's 71 and he's in the janitorial contract pool, which means he doesn't have stable hours, no benefits, and no formal standing with the company." She paused. "I want to address that. I want to give him a proper role, something that uses what he knows. But I wanted to flag it to you because you met him before I did, and because any change like that would sit within your division." Mason looked at her. He thought about the lobby on Tuesday morning, about Gus pressing a cloth against the wheel housing with the stubborn patience of a man who had no other tools available and wasn't going to quit, about the way he'd handed over the cable ties without comment once Mason had explained what was actually wrong. "Make it part of my first week's agenda," Mason said. "I'd like to have that conversation with him myself." Evelyn nodded. "All right," she said. "Then we'll start Monday." He canceled the noon shift on the way to Sophie's school. The dispatch coordinator took it professionally. They always did when you gave more than an hour's notice, which was the minimum threshold of professional courtesy in that world. He said he'd taken a full-time position and wouldn't be available for future calls. The coordinator said, "Congratulations," in the efficient, effectless way of someone who received this news regularly and was glad for the person and immediately mentally redistributing the slot. He walked the remaining 6 blocks to Westfield Elementary rather than taking the subway, because the afternoon was cold but clear, and he needed to move, needed the physical fact of pavement under his feet and air in his lungs, while his head sorted through the last 72 hours with the methodical after-the-fact quality that important decisions always had once they were made and irreversible. He was employed. He was employed starting Monday at a salary that was more than he'd ever earned in a single year, including the best years of the shop, which had been good years, genuinely good, the years before Claire's diagnosis when the business was finding its footing, and Sophie was small enough to fall asleep in the workshop sometimes, in the old armchair he'd kept in the corner for exactly that purpose, while he finished evening work on a commission. Those had been the years he measured everything else against now, and this was more. Structurally, financially, practically, more. He was not sure yet what to do with that. He arrived at Westfield Elementary at 2:58. The pickup area was filling with the usual afternoon assembly. Parents, grandparents, a few older siblings, a nanny he recognized from previous pickups who always arrived first and stood at the exact same spot on the sidewalk regardless of weather. He stood near the edge of the gathering, hands in his jacket pockets, and watched the main doors. Sophie came out at 3:19, 4 minutes late, which was within her normal range. She had her backpack on properly, and her jacket half unzipped in the unselfconscious way of children who had been indoors all day and didn't fully register temperature change. She spotted him immediately and altered her trajectory toward him with the slight acceleration that she'd had since she was a toddler. Not quite running, but wanting to. "You're here," she said, like this was notable. "I'm here," he said. "I thought Mrs. Patel was coming." "I made it." She fell into step beside him, reaching up to take his hand without announcing she was going to, the way she'd been doing since she was old enough to walk. He adjusted his pace to hers, which was the calculation he made automatically without thinking about it, the way you calculated all the logistics of being someone's parent. "How was school?" he asked. "Fine, we did fractions. I don't think I understood all of it." "Which part?" "The part where you add them, but the numbers on the bottom don't add." "Denominators," he said. "We can work through it tonight." "Okay." A pause. "Mrs. Patel said you called her this morning." "I did." "She said it was good news." Sophie looked up at him with the sideways assessment she deployed when she was triangulating adult information. "Is it?" He looked down at her. "I got a job," he said. "A real one, starting Monday. Sophie was quiet for 2 full strides. Like a building job? She asked. Sort of, he said. In a building. I'm going to be in charge of making sure the people who keep the building running feel like their work matters, and fixing what's broken. She thought about this with visible seriousness. That sounds like you, she said finally. Yeah, he said. It kind of does. Will you still pick me up? Most days, he said. Some days Mrs. Patel will. But most days, me. She nodded, apparently satisfied with this allocation. Then, after another 2 strides, can we have pizza tonight to celebrate? He thought about his bank account, which would remain essentially what it was until the first paycheck cleared, which would be 2 weeks out at minimum. He thought about the electric bill. He thought about the cost of a pizza. Yeah, he said, we can have pizza. The one with the thin crust, she said, not the thick one. I know which one. You ordered the thick one that one time. That was 2 years ago. I still remember, she said firmly. What? He started the following Monday. Diane, Evelyn's assistant, had prepared an orientation packet that was thorough without being condescending, which Mason appreciated. The administrative systems were the most foreign territory, the facilities management software, the vendor database, the budget tracking interface that the operations director, a precise, measured man named Keith Albright, walked him through on the first afternoon with the patient efficiency of someone who had taught software to reluctant learners before and had made peace with the pace of it. Keith Albright was 53, had been with Hale Dynamics for 7 years, and wore reading glasses on a cord around his neck that he put on and took off with the frequency of a man who needed them more than he wanted to admit. He was cordial but careful with Mason in the first days, not unfriendly, but assessing, in the way that competent people who have watched an organization struggle through bad leadership assess the new arrival, willing to extend provisional trust, not yet willing to extend the full thing. The budget cycle for your division runs quarterly, Keith explained on that first afternoon, the spreadsheet open between them. You'll have discretionary allocation for the first 3 months while we build your baseline. Evelyn's approved a wider margin while you find your footing. After that, you'll be presenting a quarterly proposal to the Ops Committee. What's the Ops Committee? Evelyn, myself, the heads of legal and HR, and the VP of real estate, Keith said. We meet monthly. Your facilities issues have historically been tabled at the end of those meetings and given about 12 minutes. He said this without commentary, but his expression communicated clearly that he found 12 minutes inadequate. I'll need more than 12 minutes, Mason said. Yes, Keith said. I suspect you will. Is that something Evelyn can change? Evelyn can change the agenda structure, yes, Keith said. I'd recommend giving it a month before you ask. Let the committee see what you're bringing before you ask for more time to bring it. Mason looked at him. That's good advice. Keith looked slightly surprised, as though he'd expected pushback. I try. The first week was disorienting in the particular way that all new environments were disorienting, not from lack of capability, but from the sheer volume of context he didn't yet have, the names of vendors he'd never dealt with, the history of decisions made before his arrival that had consequences he was still mapping, the internal politics of a mid-sized corporate structure which operated on its own logic that was related to but not identical to the logic of small business or trade work. He made notes. He asked questions of whoever was in the best position to answer them, which was not always the most senior person available. He got things wrong, misread a vendor contract term on Wednesday, had to go back to Keith to clarify, which was embarrassing in the way small professional errors are embarrassing but not catastrophic. He went down to the sub-basement every single day, not to supervise, not to check in officially, just to be present, to be in the space, to have conversations that weren't initiated by a meeting request. He brought coffee twice, not as a gesture of largesse, just because he was stopping at the cart in the lobby anyway, and he'd learned that Breckenridge drank his black, and that the younger members of the electrical team had a preference for the flavored pods that the main machine also stocked. Breckenridge's response to Mason's official arrival was characteristically minimal. He didn't treat Mason differently than he had during that first morning tour. He talked to him the same way, directly, without the protective layer of formality that people usually adopted with management, and Mason understood that this was the highest possible form of professional acceptance from a man like Breckenridge, and treated it accordingly. Ray Suarez was another matter. Ray had apparently spent the week between Mason's first visit and his official start date asking questions about him. Mason found this out third hand, through the electricians, who mentioned it without apparent guile. The young worker wanted to know who Mason was, where he'd come from, why Evelyn Sterling had gone outside the normal hiring process. Mason didn't address it directly. He just showed up, and he was consistent, and he made a point of finding Ray in the natural course of his daily movement through the sub-basement and having brief, functional conversations that weren't about Ray's status or Mason's authority, but about the work, what Ray was doing, what he was running into, what he'd figured out. On the Thursday of his second week, Ray stopped him in the corridor near the mechanical room. "Mr. Carter." "Mason," Mason said. He'd said it twice already. "Mason." Ray adjusted to it with visible effort. I've been putting together a report on the recurring issues in the HVAC zones on floors 12 through 16. There's a pattern in the temperature variance complaints that I think I've traced back to a damper calibration issue, but I didn't want to just go fix it without documenting it first, because last time I moved on something without documentation, He stopped, reorganized. I wanted to do it right this time. Mason looked at him. "Show me the report." Ray produced it from a folder he'd been carrying, which told Mason he'd brought it with him specifically for this conversation rather than finding Mason on impulse. The report was handwritten, 3 pages, diagrams, a table of complaint timestamps cross-referenced against the HVAC cycle logs. It was careful and clear and showed a quality of systematic thinking that a lot of people with more experience didn't apply. Mason read it standing in the corridor, turning the pages deliberately. "The damper calibration theory is right," he said. "Look at this cluster here." He pointed to the timestamp table. "All the variance complaints come within 40 minutes of the HVAC cycling into its morning startup sequence. That's consistent with dampers that were set for a different occupancy load and never adjusted after the 12th floor was reconfigured." Ray was nodding, following the logic. "Document this properly," Mason said, handing it back. "Type it up, include your methodology, send it to Breckenridge for technical sign-off, and CC me. Then submit it through the facilities request system as a preventive maintenance item. Don't fix it until it's logged." "That's what I wanted to do," Ray said. "I just wasn't sure if—" "You were sure," Mason said. "You did the right process before you came to me. You just needed someone to tell you it was the right process." He paused. "That's not a character flaw. That's what happens when the environment has been telling you the opposite for long enough." Ray was quiet for a second. "The thing with the calibration equipment," he said. "When I dropped it." "You don't have to explain that to me. I know, I want you to know I'm not careless." "I know you're not careless," Mason said. "Your report is 3 pages with a data table. Careless people don't write 3-page reports with data tables." He paused. "How it was handled at the time was wrong. That's not your debt to carry forward." Something in Ray's posture changed. Not dramatically, not the kind of visible shift you'd put in a movie. Just the small, structural release of something that had been held in place by effort for long enough that releasing it was its own kind of work. "Okay," Ray said. "I'll write it up today." "Good," Mason said. He kept walking. He didn't look back. Making that moment bigger than it was would have cost it something. The conversation with Gus happened on a Friday morning in the 3rd week, in the small equipment room adjacent to the main janitorial supply station on the B level. Mason had asked Gus if he had 20 minutes. Gus had looked at him with the wariness that 14 years of institutional invisibility produces in a person and said he supposed he could find 20 minutes. They sat on upturned supply crates, the room had no chairs, and Mason explained it plainly. "I want to offer you a position," he said. "Formal, permanent, within the facilities division. Not janitorial contract, a salaried advisory role. The title we're looking at is Facilities History and Systems Advisor. The work would involve documenting your knowledge of this building's systems, infrastructure, and maintenance history, and being available to consult when we're troubleshooting issues or evaluating what work has been done before on a given system." Gus looked at him. He was a small man, compactly built, with the particular physical density of people who have done physical work their entire lives. His expression was unreadable for a long moment. "Advisory role," he said. "Yes." "I'm a janitor." You're a janitor who knows where every original pipe run is in this building and which contractor poured the secondary foundation and what the load rating is on the B-level service lift, Mason said. That knowledge is currently locked in your head with no way for the building to access it officially. When you retire, it's gone. He paused. That's a structural problem, and you're the solution to it. Gus looked at the floor for a moment. Benefits? He said. Full package. Medical, dental, stable hours. We'd work out a schedule that makes sense for you. I'm 71. I know. I could retire in 3 years if the numbers work. They'd work, Mason said. I ran them with Keith. Gus was quiet for a long time. Mason let the quiet sit without trying to fill it. Some decisions needed their own space. Why? Gus said finally. Not suspiciously, just genuinely. The way someone asks why when they've spent long enough being overlooked that the presence of recognition requires an explanation. Mason thought about how to answer that honestly. Because you know things that matter, he said. And because the way a place treats people who've given it a long time tells you something true about what kind of place it is. He paused. I'd like this to be a different kind of place. Gus looked at him steadily. I'll need to think about it, he said. Take the weekend, Mason said. Gus nodded. He picked up the mop handle he'd leaned against the wall when they sat down, then set it back. An old habit interrupted by the unfamiliar weight of the moment. The wheel, Gus said. On the cart. 3 weeks ago. Yeah. You just fixed it. It was a simple fix. Nobody stopped before, Gus said, in 14 years. Lots of people walked by that cart. He looked at Mason directly. Why did you stop? Mason thought about it honestly. The wheel was broken, he said, and I knew how to fix it. Gus was quiet for a moment. That's all? That's all? Gus picked up the mop handle again, this time with the settled intention of a man who was going back to work. I'll give you my answer Monday, he said. The internal resistance came in the 5th week. Mason had expected it, not because he was cynical, but because he understood that systems develop immunities to change the way bodies develop immunities to foreign elements, and the immune response of a corporate structure didn't always distinguish between a threat and a correction. The source was a man named Philip Crane, who was the VP of Procurement and who had, over the previous 3.5 years, developed a set of vendor relationships in the facilities division that had, Mason discovered gradually, through the invoice records Keith helped him navigate, included several arrangements where the same contractors were repeatedly engaged for work that was not always competitively bid. The contractors in question were not criminally bad. The work they produced was acceptable, but it was expensive, consistently about 15 to 20% above comparable market rates, and the relationships had been grandfathered through 3 successive department heads in ways that had never been formally reviewed. When Mason began requesting competitive bids for upcoming preventive maintenance contracts in his 6th week, Crane appeared in his office, not the sub-basement but the small office on the 9th floor that Evelyn had arranged for Mason, which had a window and a door and the accumulated smell of the person who had used it before, and stood in the doorway with the relaxed authority of a man who is accustomed to having weight in a room. Carter, he said, Philip Crane, we haven't formally met. Mason looked up from the bid documents on his desk. I know who you are. Have a seat. Crane came in but didn't sit. I was mid-50s, well-maintained in the expensive way that senior managers at certain income levels were. Silver at the temples. The kind of posture that came from decades of being the tallest status in whatever room he was in. He looked around Mason's office with an expression that was almost entirely neutral and therefore communicated a great deal. I heard you're putting the quarterly maintenance contracts out to open bid, Crane said. That's correct. The current vendors have a long history with this building. I know, Mason said. I've been through the service records. The work is adequate. He paused. The pricing is not competitive. Crane's expression stayed even. Those relationships have value beyond the invoice price. What value specifically? A brief pause. Institutional knowledge, reliability. They know the building. Gus knows the building better than any of them, Mason said, and he's now on staff full-time. Something shifted fractionally in Crane's face. Not anger, something more controlled than that. A recalibration. I'd recommend not disrupting established vendor relationships in your first 2 months, he said. It sends a signal. I know what signal it sends, Mason said. I'm comfortable with it. The two men looked at each other. Crane was not accustomed to this particular quality of stillness in the people he tried to redirect. He was accustomed to the kind of new managers who translated his suggestions into instructions because they understood the implicit weight behind them. Mason's stillness was not defiance. It was simply the absence of the response Crane had expected to trigger. I'd suggest you discuss it with Evelyn before moving forward, Crane said. I spoke with Evelyn about the bidding process 2 weeks ago, Mason said. It's within my divisional authority, but if you'd like to raise it with her directly, I have no objection. Crane looked at him for a moment longer. I'll do that, he said. Okay, Mason said. Crane left. Mason sat for a moment, then picked up his pen and went back to the bid documents. His hand was steady. He noticed that too. The conversation with Evelyn happened 2 days later. Not because she called him in, but because they had a scheduled check-in every Tuesday, which she'd instituted from the start as a standing item rather than an occasional appointment, which told him something about how she operated. Crane came to see me, she said. I expected that. He thinks you're creating instability in vendor relationships that have served the building for years. He thinks I'm threatening his margin, Mason said. Evelyn was quiet for a half second. That's a direct statement. It's what the invoices suggest, Mason said. I'm not making a corruption accusation. I don't have evidence for that. I have evidence of consistently above market pricing in contracts that were never competitively reviewed. That's a procurement problem and a budget problem, regardless of intention. What did you tell him? That the bidding process is within my divisional authority, and I'd already discussed it with you. That's accurate, she said. I know. She looked at him. Crane has been with this company 8 years. He has standing with the board. I know that too, Mason said. I'm not trying to make an enemy. I'm trying to correct a budget leak. Those aren't the same thing. Crane will experience them as the same thing. Then Crane and I will have to find a way to work around that, Mason said. I'm willing to make the process collaborative. So I'm not going to give him veto power over competitive bidding, but I can keep him in the loop on vendor evaluations. Bring him in as a stakeholder rather than working around him. Evelyn considered this. That's a more sophisticated approach than I expected from week 6. I've dealt with people who have more to lose than me before, Mason said. They're usually more manageable than they look if you don't make them feel cornered. She looked at him with that reading expression he'd come to recognize as something she did when she was updating her assessment of a person. All right, she said, handle it. I will. The check-in moved on to other items. The HVAC damper recalibration, RAISE project, now logged and approved and halfway through implementation, with documented temperature variance already showing measurable improvement across the affected floors. The Gus transition, which was in its second week and was proceeding at the pace Gus himself set, which was deliberate and thorough. The moisture intrusion in Ortega's stairwell, which had been traced to exactly the HVAC intake issue Mason had theorized during his first morning visit, and which was now scheduled for exterior repair in the following month's maintenance window. Ortega told me something, Evelyn said, near the end of the meeting. Mason waited. He said this is the first time in 4 years that a problem he reported has been addressed in the same quarter he reported it. She paused. He said it without any particular emotion, just as a fact. It is a fact, Mason said. I know, she said. That's what made it hard to hear. He looked at her. She was looking at the window, the city bright and gray in the early November light. There was something in her expression that wasn't quite what he expected. Something that looked more like the weight of what had been wrong for a long time and less like satisfaction at it beginning to be corrected. He understood that. The cost of neglect didn't disappear when you started paying attention. Sometimes it got heavier. You're doing the right thing, he said. Not as reassurance, as a statement of observable fact. She turned from the window and looked at him. So are you, she said. He picked up his notebook from the table, he'd been keeping one, handwritten, the kind he used to keep for the shop, a daily record of what needed doing and what had been done and what was still unresolved. He stood up. Same time Tuesday? He said. Same time Tuesday, she said. He walked out of her office and down to the elevator, and wrote it down not to the lobby, but to the B level, the sub-basement, where the building's real life ran on in the hum of systems and the skilled work of people who had been waiting longer than they should have had to for someone to simply show up and pay attention. Breckenridge was in the mechanical room, working through an inspection log with two of the junior mechanics. He looked up when Mason came through the door, assessed the situation, and went back to the log without comment. Mason pulled up a stool and sat down. "Where are we on the secondary chiller?" he asked. Breckenridge turned the clipboard. They got to work. The secondary chiller got fixed in November. It wasn't a dramatic repair. No crisis, no emergency shutdown, no narrow escape from a catastrophic system failure. Mason and Breckenridge had been tracking the performance degradation in the unit for 3 weeks through the monitoring logs. And when the numbers reached the threshold they'd agreed on, they scheduled the work on a weekend when the upper floors were unoccupied, brought in the right contractor through the new competitive bidding process at roughly 18% below what the previous vendor would have quoted, and the job was done clean by Sunday afternoon. The chiller came back online Monday morning without anyone in the glass offices above noticing that anything had happened. That was the point. That was what good maintenance looked like when it was functioning correctly. Invisible, quiet, the building simply working the way the building was supposed to work while the people inside it went about their lives without ever having to think about why the temperature was comfortable or the lights stayed on or the elevators arrived when they were called. Mason understood this in his bones in a way that took him a few months to fully articulate, even to himself. The work was not supposed to be visible. The work was supposed to disappear into function. The failure of a maintenance culture wasn't measured in broken things. It was measured in the accumulation of small degradations that nobody caught because nobody was paying attention. Until one day the sum of all those small neglected things arrived at once as something too large to quietly fix on a weekend. He wrote that down in his notebook on the Monday after the chiller repair. Not as a policy statement, just as a thing he'd understood. Breckenridge, reading over his shoulder in the uninvited way that Mason had come to accept as one of the man's particular qualities, said, "You should put that in the presentation for the ops committee." "The committee gets 12 minutes, Mason said. "You've been here 2 months, Breckenridge said. "How long are you going to let that stand?" Mason looked at him. "I'll ask Evelyn this week," he said. He got 25 minutes on the December agenda. The ops committee meeting was the last Tuesday before the holiday break, which meant the room had the particular collective distraction of people who were already partially somewhere else, thinking about travel, about family, about the accumulated logistics of the end of a year. Philip Crane sat at the far end of the table with the practiced neutrality he'd adopted toward Mason since their conversation in Mason's office and the subsequent negotiation over vendor evaluation, which had resolved into a working arrangement that was not warm but was functional. Crane reviewed the competitive bids now. He didn't like it, and he didn't pretend to, but he participated, and his participation gave the process a legitimacy it needed. Mason stood at the head of the table, so he'd brought no PowerPoint, no presentation deck, just the notebook and a single printed page with 4 numbers on it. He started with the numbers. Turnover in the facilities division, 41 resignations in the 18 months before his arrival, 3 in the 4 months since. Preventive maintenance completion rate, 62% before, 91% now. Facilities-related complaint tickets from building occupants, down 40% quarter over quarter. Vendor contract costs, down an average of 16% through competitive bidding across the contracts reviewed so far. He let the numbers sit for a moment without commentary. Then he talked about people, not in the abstract way that corporate presentations talked about people, not human capital or talent retention or employee engagement metrics. He talked about Breckenridge carrying a co-lead position alone for 5 months, because nobody above him had understood that the weight of it was unsustainable. He talked about Ortega, who had stopped filing maintenance reports for over a year, not because he stopped noticing problems, but because he'd stopped believing the reports went anywhere. He talked about Ray Suarez, who had nearly been discarded from a building that needed him because the culture around him had taught him to hide his mistakes instead of fixing them. He talked about the damper calibration on floors 12 through 16, which Ray had identified, documented, and resolved, a problem that had been generating occupant complaints for 2 quarters and cost nothing to fix once someone paid attention to the pattern. The room was quiet in a way that was different from polite committee silence. "What do you need going forward?" Evelyn asked. She was at the other end of the table, and she asked it in the tone of a genuine question rather than a facilitated meeting prompt. The Breckenridge co-lead position filled, Mason said. We've had 2 internal candidates come up through the team who are ready. Breckenridge has flagged them both. I'd like authority to promote from within rather than running an external search. Done, Evelyn said. What else? A training budget. Modest. Raise the immediate case, but there are 3 other people in the division who have the capability to advance and no pathway to do it without formal credentials in specific technical areas. I've priced out the certification programs. It's not significant relative to what we're saving on the vendor contracts. Evelyn looked at Keith Albright. Keith nodded once. We can build it into Q1, Keith said. Anything else? Evelyn asked. Mason looked around the table. He'd been watching the faces during the presentation, not the executives, but the particular quality of attention they'd given him, which had shifted somewhere around the second set of numbers from the polite attention of people waiting for their time back to something more engaged. The break room on B level, he said. It's been in bad shape since before I got here. 2 of the microwaves don't work, 1 of the refrigerators runs warm, the ventilation is inadequate for the number of people who use the space. It's small. The fix is maybe $3,000 in materials and a weekend of labor. He paused. I want to do the labor myself, with whoever from the team wants to come in. He looked around the table. It's not a facilities issue. It's a statement about what kind of place this is. The room was quiet for a moment. Philip Crane, to Mason's mild surprise, said, Approve the budget. Nobody objected. They did the break room the second weekend of January. Mason came in Saturday morning with his own tools, which he preferred to the building's general kit for work that required precision. Breckenridge came. Ray came, which was not surprising. Ortega came with his nephew, who was apparently also in construction. 2 of the electricians came to handle the ventilation upgrade properly rather than patching it. Gus came and spent most of the day telling them, in accurate and specific detail, exactly why each of the problems in the room had developed and what had been tried on each of them in previous years. Information worth more than any inspection report. It took most of Saturday and a few hours Sunday morning. The result was not a renovation. The walls were the same walls, the floor was the same floor, the ceiling tiles were original to a decade Mason couldn't precisely identify. But everything worked. The ventilation moved actual air. The refrigerator ran cold. The tables were level. Mason shimmed every leg until the surfaces were true, which was a small thing that nobody would consciously notice, but which the body registers as ease rather than friction. He hung a corkboard on the east wall because there had been nowhere for people to put things. Schedules, notices, the small informal communications of a working group. And he put nothing on it himself, because what went on it wasn't his to decide. By Monday morning, it had 3 things on it. A photograph of the whole team from a previous year's company picnic that someone had found and printed, a handwritten shift schedule that Breckenridge had posted, and a drawing in crayon, left anonymously, which Mason suspected was Ray's doing, though he never confirmed it, of a building with small figures standing in its windows, each figure with a tiny yellow hard hat. Mason stood in the doorway of the finished break room on Monday morning before anyone else arrived downstairs, holding his coffee, looking at what a weekend's work and some basic respect for a space could produce. He was not a sentimental man by nature. He'd lived through too much that sentiment couldn't fix to put too much weight on it. But he stood there for a moment anyway, in the quiet of the sub-basement before the day started, and he let himself feel the full weight of it. Not pride exactly, something less clean than pride. Something mixed up with the memory of all the mornings in the last 2 years when he'd woken up before 5 and lain in the dark, calculating what he could afford and what he couldn't, and whether the math was going to work out. It had worked out. Not perfectly. Not the way it would have worked out if Claire had lived, if the shop had survived, if a different sequence of choices and catastrophes had led somewhere else. It had worked out in the particular way of lives that have been through something, rebuilt into a shape that was different from what it would have been, and not lesser for that, just different, bearing the marks of what it had been through the way repaired things bear the history of their repair. He drank his coffee. He went to work. Well, the thing about the following months was that the changes didn't look like transformation from the inside. From inside the work, it just looked like one thing, and then another thing, and then another thing. The co-lead promotion, which went to a woman named Vasquez, who had been with the team for 3 years and whom Breckenridge had flagged as capable in his very first conversation with Mason, and whose promotion produced a visible and immediate effect on the team's morale because she was known and trusted by everyone in the division. The certification programs, which Ray enrolled in first, and which two others followed within a month. The vendor audit, which concluded in February with a formal procurement reform that Crane signed off on, and which Keith incorporated into the new divisional budget framework. The second competitive bid cycle, which produced better results than the first because the new vendors understood they were competing seriously and adjusted their pricing accordingly. The turnover number in the Q2 report was 0. Not low. 0. No resignations from the facilities division across the full second quarter. Keith mentioned it at the Ops Committee meeting with the careful understatement of someone who understood that the number was significant and didn't want to make more of it than the facts warranted. Mason didn't comment on it. Breckenridge, who had received a copy of the report through the divisional distribution, sent Mason a single line by internal message. "That's the first time since I've been here." Mason read it twice and then went back to his work. What he noticed, in the way you notice things that build slowly rather than arriving all at once, was that the sub-basement had changed its sound. Not literally. The hum of the mechanical systems was the same. The fluorescent lights carried the same faint frequency they'd always had. But the human sound of the place had changed. There was conversation where there had been the careful quiet of people who'd learned to keep their thoughts to themselves. There was occasional laughter, which was not a metric that appeared in any of Keith's reports, but which Mason tracked privately as one of the more reliable indicators of whether a working environment was healthy or wasn't. There was the particular sound of people who were moving through a space with ownership rather than just occupancy. The difference between a person who has been told where to go and a person who knows where they're going and why it matters. He noticed it. He didn't make speeches about it. He didn't send emails noting the cultural progress. He just showed up, consistently, the way he'd always shown up for things that mattered, and he let the consistency do the work that policy documents couldn't. Evelyn called him into her office on a Thursday afternoon in late spring. Not a scheduled check-in, a separate ask, which was unusual enough that he paid attention to the fact of it. She was at her desk when he arrived, and she had the expression she wore when she was going to say something that cost her something to say. Not reluctance exactly, but the particular care of a person who has thought through a thing carefully before speaking it. "Sit down," she said. He sat. "The board met last week," she said. "There's been a conversation building for a few months that I should have told you about sooner." She paused. "There are two members of the board who believe the pace of change in the facilities division has been too aggressive, specifically the procurement reform and the budget reallocations for the training programs." Mason waited. "They've raised the question of whether the position was appropriately scoped, whether the authority I gave you was consistent with what a facilities director role should carry." She looked at him directly. "I want you to know I don't agree with them. The numbers support every decision you've made, but I also want to be honest with you that the conversation is happening." "Is my position at risk?" he asked. "No," she said. "I won't let it be." She said it simply, without drama. "But I want you to understand the environment. Crane's relationships ran deeper than I fully appreciated, and the reforms you implemented touched things that had been comfortable for certain people for a long time. Discomfort creates narrative." "What's the narrative?" "That you're an unconventional hire who moved too fast." She paused, which is interesting because the turnover number in Q2 was 0, and the occupant complaint rate is down 53%, and we're spending 16% less on maintenance contracts than we were 2 years ago. She looked at him. The facts and the narrative are running in parallel, and they're not talking to each other. Mason considered this. "What do you need from me?" he said. She looked slightly surprised, not at the question, he thought, but at the order of it, that he'd asked what she needed rather than what was going to happen to him. "I need you to present at the next board meeting," she said. "Not the Ops Committee, the full board." She paused. "Yourself. The way you presented to the Ops Committee in December, with the numbers and the actual people behind the numbers. No deck, no consultants, no managed narrative." "When?" 3 weeks. He nodded. "All right." "Mason." She stopped, which was unlike her. She was not a person who stopped in the middle of what she was saying. She looked at him with the directness she always had and something more personal underneath it. I've watched you in this building for 8 months. I've watched the way the people in the sub-basement respond to you. I've watched Breckenridge, who trusted nobody in management for years, sit in the ops committee room and say your name the way people say the name of someone who has earned something real. She paused. I want you to know that whatever happens in the board meeting, that's not nothing. That doesn't go away. He looked at her for a moment. She meant it. He could tell the difference by now. I know, he said. He stood up, picked up his notebook. I'll have something ready in 2 weeks, he said. That gives you a week to tell me what's wrong with it. She almost smiled. That works. He told Sophie about the board meeting that night because she had been asking, with the regular persistent interest of a child who tracked her father's life seriously, how the job was going, and he had gotten into the habit of telling her the truth about it at whatever level of detail she could work with. They were at the kitchen table, Sophie doing homework. The fractions she'd struggled with in September had been conquered, and she was now somewhere in the territory of basic geometry, which she found more intuitive, possibly because she'd grown up watching her father measure things. Mason had made pasta, which was the weeknight meal that required the least thought, and the most of his attention went to the conversation. There's a meeting coming up, he said, with the bigger group of people who run the company. I need to explain what I've been doing and why. Sophie looked up from her worksheet. You mean convince them? Sort of. Are they going to fire you? No, he said, but some of them think I moved too fast. She considered this with the furrowed brow expression she'd inherited from him. Did you? He thought about it honestly. He owed her honest answers. Not frightening ones, but honest ones. Maybe in 1 or 2 places, he said, but mostly, no. The things I changed needed changing. Then tell them that, she said, with the clean certainty of someone who had not yet learned that the gap between being right and being heard was one of the primary frustrations of adult life. It's a little more complicated than that, he said. Usually you say complicated things are just simple things with extra steps. He looked at her. I say that? You said it when I couldn't do the denominators, she said. You said fractions look complicated, but they're just division with extra steps. That's about fractions. Same thing, she said, with the unassailable logic of a 7-year-old who had just scored a point and knew it. He looked at her across the kitchen table, her worksheet, her pencil, the geometry shapes she was measuring with a plastic ruler that had a cartoon rocket on the handle. The crane drawing was still on the refrigerator, though the tape had been replaced twice because the original electrical tape had given out. He'd moved it once, slightly, to level it, and Sophie had noticed immediately and moved it back to where it had been. He thought about the board presentation. He thought about numbers and narratives and the gap between them. He thought about what it actually was that he'd done in the last 8 months, stripped of all the corporate language that got layered over it in reports and committee meetings. He'd paid attention. He'd shown up. He'd listened to people who had stopped expecting to be heard. He'd fixed what he knew how to fix and asked questions about what he didn't. And he'd treated the people around him as the experts on their own work that they actually were, rather than as variables in a management equation. That was it. That was the whole of it. He picked up his notebook and wrote 3 sentences in the margin of the page he'd been using. Sophie watched him write, then went back to her worksheet. Dad, she said without looking up. Yeah. You fixed the big door first thing, she said. Remember, you told me. She drew a careful line along the ruler. If you can fix the door, you can fix the meeting. He looked at her. She was not being cute. She was not performing wisdom for his benefit. She was a 7-year-old who had inherited his particular habit of thinking about problems in terms of what was actually broken and what the right tool for it was, and she was applying it with the unself-conscious directness of someone who hadn't yet learned to apologize for being right. Yeah, he said quietly. You're probably right. Probably, she agreed with appropriate scientific modesty. The board meeting was on a Wednesday morning in June. 12 people around a table on the 18th floor, which was one above Evelyn's office and had the particular formal gravity of rooms that were only used for decisions that mattered. Floor-to-ceiling windows on 2 sides. The city running away in every direction in the early summer light, clear and bright and indifferent. Mason stood at the end of the table with his notebook and his printed page of numbers, and he told them the truth. Not the managed version of the truth. Not the version that protected the comfortable narrative of either side. He told them what the building had looked like from the sub-basement when he arrived, what Breckenridge had been carrying, what Ortega had stopped reporting, what the blank boxes on the organizational chart had actually represented in human terms. He told them about Ray Suarez's 3-page handwritten report and what it said about what the previous environment had cost in suppressed capability. He told them about Gus, who had 14 years of institutional knowledge that the building had been paying for without accessing. He told them about the vendor reform. He explained the pricing differential plainly, and he explained what the procurement relationship had looked like from the invoice records without making a character accusation about anyone, because character accusations would have distracted from the fact, and the fact was sufficient. He showed them the numbers. He did not interpret the numbers. He let them sit. He talked about the break room. Not as a feel-good story, as a practical statement about what it cost to signal to experienced workers that they mattered, versus what it cost to keep replacing them after they decided they didn't. He talked for 22 of his allotted 25 minutes. Then he stopped. The room was quiet in the particular way of rooms that have received more than they expected. The board chair, a woman in her mid-60s named Harriet Voss, who had the precise, assembled quality of someone who had sat in rooms like this for a very long time and had developed a comprehensive immunity to being told what to think, looked at him for a long moment. "Mr. Carter," she said, "you came in here without a presentation deck." "Yes," he said. "Why?" He thought about it for a second. "Because a deck would have been the managed version," he said. "I didn't want you to see the managed version. You have enough of those." Voss was quiet for another moment. "The 2 board members who raised concerns about the pace of change," she said. "They're not in this room today." Mason hadn't known that. He looked at Evelyn briefly. She was watching him from her seat at the table, giving him nothing, which was the right thing to give him. "I see," he said. "They submitted their concerns in writing before the meeting," Voss said. "I've read them. I've also read your Q2 report." She looked at him. A 0-turnover quarter in a division that had 41 resignations in the 18 months before you arrived is not the result of moving too aggressively. It's the result of moving at the right speed for the actual problem. She paused. "I want that on record." Mason said nothing. "Any questions for Mr. Carter?" Voss asked the room. There were 3 questions. He answered all of them directly. The meeting ended 4 minutes early, which he later learned was unusual. Evelyn caught him in the hall afterward. "Well?" she said. "I don't know yet," he said. Voss said 0 turnover isn't the result of moving too aggressively. I heard her. That's effectively the board's position, Mason. He looked at her. Then we're okay. We're okay, she confirmed. He nodded. He picked up his notebook from under his arm and started toward the elevator. Mason! He turned back. She was in her chair in the hall, the city light coming through the window behind her, and she was looking at him with the expression she'd had on the second-floor balcony when she watched him fix Gus's cart. The expression of someone who has seen something they weren't looking for and understood immediately what it meant. Thank you, she said, for coming back that first morning. He thought about the sidewalk. Diane half jogging across the pavement toward him. The subway entrance 40 yards away. You sent someone after me, he said. You stopped, she said. He held that for a moment. Yeah, he said. I did. He got in the elevator. Yeah. That evening he picked Sophie up from school, made it, 3:19 exactly, her standard 4 minutes late, and they walked home the long way, which was a thing they did on days that warranted it. The long way went past a construction site on Meridian Avenue where a new mixed-use building was going up, and Sophie always slowed down there to look at the crane. She stopped. The crane was working, lifting a steel beam into the upper structure, the slow hydraulic certainty of it, carrying the load without apparent effort. Sophie watched it with her chin up and her hand in his, the way she'd watched cranes since she first understood what they did. Biggest thing in sight, she said, the way she always said it. Every time, he said, the way he always answered. They stood there for a moment, the two of them, watching the crane do its work in the late afternoon light. He thought about the things that had led to this particular corner on this particular evening. The shop, and Claire, and the medical bills, and the morning he'd walked into Hale Dynamics with holes in his biography and a screwdriver in his backpack pocket, and the broken wheel on a cleaning cart that he'd stopped to fix because the wheel was broken and he knew how to fix it. He thought about all the ways that sequence could have gone differently, all the versions of those 2 years in which different choices led to different corners on different evenings. He didn't have a clean way to understand it. He wasn't sure a clean understanding was available or even the right thing to want. Life didn't resolve into lessons the way stories did. It just continued, and you continued with it, and sometimes the thing you couldn't fix became the road that led you somewhere you needed to go. What he knew, the thing he actually knew, not theoretically, but in his hands and his body, and the part of him that had rebuilt enough broken things to understand what rebuilt things actually looked like, was that the version of the world that told you a person's value could be read off a resume was wrong. Not wrong the way a bad argument was wrong the way a faulty measurement was wrong, using the right instrument on the wrong thing and wondering why the reading didn't make sense. The character of a person wasn't in their credentials. It was in what they did when there was no particular reason to do the right thing. It was in whether they stopped for a broken wheel when they were already running late and already under pressure and already carrying more than they should have had to carry. It was in the small, unobserved choices that accumulated over a lifetime into the shape of who you actually were. He'd been lucky that someone had been watching. He knew that. He didn't take it as a sign of anything except that luck existed, and sometimes it arrived in the form of a woman on a second-floor balcony who was paying attention. But he also knew that the luck meant nothing without what had come before it. The years of doing the right thing in front of nobody, the repairs made in freezing weather for people who couldn't pay, the promises kept when keeping them cost something real, the letters that existed because of those things, the man those letters described. You couldn't manufacture that at the moment the balcony appeared. You either were that person or you weren't, and being that person had nothing to do with reward or recognition or whether anyone was watching. It was just who you were when no one was looking. Sophie tugged his hand. The beam had settled into place. The crane was releasing the hook, swinging back for the next load. "Come on," she said. "We're having pizza, right?" "Thin crust," he said. "Obviously," she said. They walked home in the early summer evening, and the crane moved behind them, patient and unhurried, lifting what needed to be lifted one load at a time.